Welcome to the Evolution Show. I'm Johan Landgren. I hope you're doing well. If you're new to the show, I'm a full-time investor and writer in sustainable tech. And on the Evolution Show, we provide inspiration to meet some of the biggest challenges of our time. And we focus on smart energy solutions, electric transports, AI, and how to combat the climate crisis. And today, we're going to talk about the biggest elephant in the room. Can we transition to a green economy only using renewables and still use economic growth as our basis for the economy? And if we can't, how can we build a sustainable economy with a new approach to material and resource use with a circular economy? And without economic growth and fossil fuels, can we sustain 8 billion people or more on this planet? Or do we have to plan for a smaller human population? These are very big questions that needs answers when our planet starts sending the bills. To help me, I invited Sweden's leading researcher on economic growth, Dr. Mikael Malmaeus. He's a researcher at the Swedish Environmental Research Institute, IVL. Dr. Malmaeus recently came out with a super interesting report that looks at these very important questions. So stick around, you don't want to miss this episode. And I hope it can give you some inspiring hope for the future. And if you like the content and you want to support the show, hit the thumbs up and consider subscribing. As always, stay ahead of the curve and stay electric. This is the Evolution Show. Welcome back to the Evolution Show, Mikael Malmaeus.
Thank you very much.
You are a researcher, economist, and environmental researcher at IVL. And last time we spoke, we were sitting in my studio and we talked about a large Swedish report where you and almost 20 different researchers and experts from different disciplines looked at 4 different scenarios with no economic growth in Sweden and how it would affect this country. And I highly recommend people to check out our conversation. I'll provide the link in the description sections below. And today we are here to talk about a new, very interesting report that you and your colleague Thomas Hahn, also an economist, recently published that not only questions the survivability of economic growth, the economic growth model we have today, but also explains why a new green economy is not the quick fix that many may expect, and that we have to stay within the planetary boundaries. But before we get into this report, can you briefly tell us a little bit about your background and why you and Professor Hahn has written this report?
Yes, so I'm an environmental researcher and economist at IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute, and I've been engaged in questions of economic growth versus the planet for a long time, quite many years. And the reason we wrote the report is basically the frustration with media and the political debate that doesn't seem to respect scientific facts. So what we try to do in the report is not only to provide the facts, which we do, but we also analyze the debate and the arguments and try to see and describe how they are arguing, how they can still go on arguing that the growth should continue despite the facts or in conflict with the facts, basically. So that's, I think, maybe one of the biggest or most important contributions of the report.
Yeah. And I would like to quote something from your report straight away. I thought was so interesting. You said that to solve a problem, you can't make it bigger. Could you perhaps elaborate what you mean with that? Because I think it's a good description of what you try to do with the report.
Yeah, so it has a double meaning. I mean, if the economy is too big, you shouldn't make it bigger. I mean, the big economy is the problem. So, I mean, many people say we should grow out. We should use the growth to become green. So green growth is basically we should grow the economy to be greener. But then you make the problem bigger, I would say.
Yeah.
But also, I think another meaning of the quote is that it seems that people imagine that an economy without growth is so completely strange and almost impossible, which I think it isn't. I mean, it's just the normal economy not growing. So I mean, it's also a way of de-dramatize the thing. I mean, okay, I think we need to make big changes, and that's, of course, it's big challenge, but just the growth issue is not the big problem. I mean, it's a big problem that we still think we need growth, but so we try to play around a little bit with that and discuss it also in the report, of course.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that point. I mean, how we can turn, this economy around to something different that is sustainable, and that why the green economy is not a simple solution, but only a part of it. And one of many important points that you have in this fantastic report, I highly recommend people to read it. Unfortunately, it's in Swedish this time, but I think this conversation will help people understand the issue. And one of the many points, as I said, that you raise, you explain why technology and higher efficiency, use of resources and technology is not enough to decrease our planetary footprint, including the environmental devastation humans cause and the climate crisis, of course. And this has to do what you called the rebound effects, which are quite central in this report, which you frequently come back to. Could you explain what the rebound effect is and why it's so important?
Yeah, so a rebound effect is quite well known in some circles. It's that when you make efficiency improvements, when you make a process more efficient, then you also see, rather than decreasing resource use, you tend to increase the volume of what you produce. So, I mean, a well-known example is, for example, if you make cars more efficient in their use of petrol. So they use less petrol per kilometer, but that makes it cheaper to drive, which makes people drive more car. So that's the rebound effects. And I mean, it's really important to see that. I mean, we talk a lot about efficiency, but it's not happening anywhere in the economy. We're not using any less resources anywhere. I mean, we're still using more of exactly everything. So efficiency doesn't seem to work. And the reason is we're not using efficiency to cut down on production and consumption. We're using efficiency to increase production and consumption. And it seems like people are surprised that this is happening. I mean, many environmental economists say that we should use efficiency to save the planet. And also economic theory says that growth and efficiency is linked. So economic theory usually says that to grow the economy, you need efficiency. But then the wrong conclusion often happens or occurs that, well, because growth and efficiency are linked, growth leads to efficiency, which leads to reduced resource use, which is completely wrong. But it is used very, very frequently in the debate. You can see it. I mean, one thing we did in the report was to go through more than 200 media texts and also books and so on. And you can see the argument coming again and again and again. Growth and efficiency are linked, so we should grow more because then we're becoming more efficient, and that is very good for the environment. But as long as we don't control for these rebound effects that sort of makes efficiency just increasing the volume of the economy, efficiency improvements is meaningless from the environmental point of view. It's actually counterproductive.
Mm. And in your report, you illustrate the importance why we need to have a completely different approach to resource use and that we have today. And because the extraction and use of resources is behind about 90% of the loss of biodiversity you mentioned in your report, we have seen so far. And the resource extraction is still growing on an annual basis, and now almost double what it was only a couple of decades ago. Why can't we go to a green growth economy? Why isn't it that simple, so to speak, that we have to take when connected to my question about resource extraction?
No, well, many things depend, of course, what you mean by a green economy. But green growth seems to be that we can grow but we're using more sustainable resources like circular materials. We recycle things and so on, or materials. But that doesn't in itself reduce resource extraction, and that's very clear. I mean, we give some numbers in the report. I mean, we're recycling maybe 20-30% of the materials. Different materials, different. I mean, the numbers are important, but I don't remember them exactly. But of course, the numbers can improve. But still, the circularity it doesn't mean that we're extracting less. Quite the contrary. I mean, since we started recycling more or less, the last 2-3 decades, the circular economy has been growing, but so has resource extraction. So the circular economy is just added to the linear economy. So we're getting more and more material intensive because we have two sources of material, virgin material and recycled material. And the only way we can reduce resource extraction is by directly limiting it. I mean, just recycling doesn't help at all, because that won't stop any mines. It won't stop any forest cuts or anything. It's just, I mean, people will go on harvesting resources in nature anyway. So what we need to do first is to limit resource extraction. And then after we've done that, I think the circular economy will help us to go on with the resources we have.
Yeah. And on the point of resource extraction, I mean, decreasing it, that the necessity of doing that, I found it remarkable. One fact that you point out in this report is that in most countries, 2/3 of the domestic material use is made in order to export it to other countries, which is 3 times more than the material that is shipped between different countries through trade. What is lost in between is not only energy because of the transports needed to ship the goods around the world, but also biomass and construction material. Could you perhaps explain this very important point that I think many people don't really realize?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, production, I mean, there are many examples. For example, we import a lot of meat. And meat, if you import 1 ton of meat, there has been a lot of biomass used, of course, to feed up that meat. I mean, animal fodder. So I don't know the numbers, but I mean, it's a lot of, much more than 1 ton biomass has been used to produce one. But the only thing that is shipped is the meat itself. So if you only measure the meat, then you can see that the material consumption is 1 ton, but the material footprint is many times that. And also construction material, I mean, the factories and the infrastructure, for example, is large amounts of material to build the factories, to build the roads and everything that is the infrastructure for production. That is not shipped between countries. So for countries that import a lot of goods or export, I mean, that is not really measured in the material consumption, but it's measured in what is called the material footprint, which is the really important measure.
Mm. And when I read about this, this point, I thought it was really interesting because I remembered an example from my own book. I wrote about our fossil dependence here in Sweden and also on a global basis. And I came back to this really bizarre example, because in Sweden, when people buy blueberries, they can choose between Swedish and imported blueberries. And the Swedish blueberries are famous for world-class level of nutrition. So they're mostly exported to China, where they are turned into health products. And then, yes, they are sent back to Europe, where they may end up in Sweden again as health products. And the blueberries we buy in Sweden, they are often imported from Poland, where they are cheaper to harvest. And this is, of course, completely madness. But as I illustrate in my Swedish book, I wrote about this a couple of years ago, it is only possible because we have really, really cheap energy. We have fossil energy that enables these kind of transports around the world. And of course, cheap labor connected and related to that. But I mean, this is, we have to shift away from this. And I think, do you agree that we perhaps, this is just an example, but we have to change this kind of, export, import, at least in this kind of, in the degree we do today. I mean, there are so many things like food production. We could grow more locally and so on. How do you look at this?
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree. I mean, the likely result if we use less fossil fuels, if we use less material and so on, is that also we will trade less. We will transport things less. So I believe in that. I think that's what's going to happen. But then I'm not so sure about exact what we will produce and consume less, because there are very many factors. For example, I mean, today it's labor cost is one of the most important factors determining how we trade. So we're actually looking for the cheap labor everywhere, and energy costs are quite low. I think that will change, because energy costs will be higher. I'm not saying that labor costs will be lower though. So, but I don't know. I mean, it will change, and energy intensive transports will change. So I think that will change.
Yeah, and I have to, when you said the labor cost, I came to think about, you know, right now we have a development of automation everywhere. So it's more and more interesting to look at this, because it enables factories and companies to produce locally, because they can keep down the labor cost, so to speak, with just introducing robotics. You don't have to feed the robots and so on, and then on top of that you can introduce AI and so on. So it's interesting to see what that would happen, but we can't avoid the problem and dependence on energy. That's still, you still have to ship things, and as the costs of transport go up, as this have to be, I mean, we have to pay this in some way, and I mean, basically nature is, as I would say, sending the bills now for a lot of things. But okay. When people talk about the new green economy, they often include the circular economy as part of the solution. And in your report, you talk about different ways we can change our economy to one where a circular flow of materials and products and services dominate, and also a sharing economy maybe become a part of our life. You make both the argument why we need to switch to this circular flow of materials, but also point to the hard fact that 44% of the materials we use is connected to food production and energy use, and they cannot be reused and recycled, and 27% is embedded in the infrastructure we have built, which is often also impossible, or at least very difficult to reuse. Do you think we can switch to a circular economy and sharing economy? And if you do think so, how could this look like?
No, I don't believe in 100% circular economy, but I'm sure the numbers can improve. So we can recycle more than we do today. But I think, I don't know exactly where the limits go, or where the limits are, but I think it's too optimistic to believe in the circular economy as a solution before we have the limits. I mean, unless we respect the limits, as I said before, I think circular economy is pointless. I mean, it's energy intensive to all those processes needed for circularity are many times they're using a lot of energy. It's not always efficient, but I mean, so I think what we should do is actually, we really should put limits on our resource extraction. That's the first thing. And then we need to adopt the economy to the resources that remain after doing that.
I totally agree. And I spoke on the topic of fossil energy and changing the current system of economic growth with one of my recent guests on the Evolution Show, Arthur Berman. And he is one of North America's leading energy analysts and a very experienced petroleum geologist. And he recognizes the climate crisis just like you, and he treats the planetary ecosystem crisis as very serious as well, and caused by humanity. But Berman also is very cynical about humanity's way to get rid of the fossil fuels without economic collapse. He argues that the switching to only renewables and not burning fossil fuels is incredibly naive and will only give us enough energy to sustain about 2 billion people and would lead to the collapse of our current civilization. I mean, to recap, we are about 8 billion now. And Berman says that we need to change, but unless people are forced to, because of a severe global crisis, like starvation or a global tax on carbon, which he also thinks is a good idea, but he finds it very difficult to implement on a global scale. He thinks that people will, protect he feared that people will, protect their life, the way of life, and they will feel threatened at least if we try to change the system. I mean, the economic growth system we have today. This is, of course, a very big question, a very difficult question, but this leads to the question of population growth and whether or not we can, sustain this, this population. What do you think about this? It's a very tricky question. I understand that.
Yeah, it's a very tricky question, of course, and it's really hard to say how many people the planet can sustain. And it of course depends on the level of welfare and the level of material standards, living standards we want. So I'm quite optimistic about how to feed people with food. I think it seems that today the food we have is enough, although it's very different. It's not distributed in a good way. And of course, a lot of the food production is dependent on fossil fuels, but I would guess it could be replaced if we focus on food production. But if we also need all the energy for so many other purposes like transports and consumption, material consumption, and very high living standards in some parts of the world, that makes it, of course, very much more difficult. So but the key question, of course, is redistribution. We're not very good at that at the moment. We have an idea that growth is good for everyone. A rising tide lifts all boats, as Margaret Thatcher, I think, said that. And that's not. It's not how it works in the economy. It doesn't seem that it won't work in the long run, because the very high consumption standards of big parts of the human population is definitely not possible to sustain for the majority. So I'm not sure if we could redistribute until it becomes sustainable, or if we actually need to degrow the population. Yeah. We have to do the maths, and I haven't done it.
This, of course, raises the question of rivalry. We have today, a growing country like China, a growing power, and also India, to mention two from the Southeast Asia, two of the key players, so to speak. And I think there is a risk that will they accept a rebalance of welfare and resources vis-a-vis, the Western world, and could this, just result in just a business as usual scenario? Because if China and India don't want to sort of hit the brake and redistribute or change the system, then of course Western world might say, okay, but we can't do that if they do it, because then they will have a technological advantage. They might use this to grow their economy and so on. So how do we? It's the dilemma. That's my point. Isn't it a very big dilemma to get everyone on the boat, so to speak, in this change?
It is a very big dilemma, of course. I agree on that, and I think I'm not that optimistic. Of course not. But we have the climate negotiations. We have processes on how to solve global conflicts and how to solve also environmental problems like the climate, for example. We have the Paris Agreement, and I think we need more global agreements on how much resources to use, how to distribute that, how much emissions we can do, how much we can emit, and so on. I think there are ways to negotiate it, but of course there will be different positions on how to do it. So, and that's a big problem. But I think, of course, it's very, very important that the rich world realizes that we are living far too high up in resource consumption. Our standard of living is not sustainable at all. And if we don't do anything about it, if we don't accept that and realize that another lifestyle is needed, then of course, China and India, if you have use them as examples, they won't even think about it. I think that's my guess. So of course, I mean, and that I think that's maybe one of the points of our report is to illustrate that, to show that, I mean, this level of production and consumption is unsustainable. Growing it more is also growing the unsustainability. So we need to degrow, or at least redistribute and accept the facts that we have limits, and we shouldn't grow the economy until we are within the limits.
Yeah, and I mean, you have already talked about it, but for me, it's like kind of finding a common ground. As you mentioned, it could be the Paris Agreement, but that seems to be, we struggle with that, and it's not enough, obviously. But how can we, if renewables could perhaps be a common ground, or something we all need to embrace anyway, because our fossil fuels are finite. Even the oil industry is aware of that. Could that be, I mean, we talked about the circular economy, but could renewables perhaps be a road towards common ground and perhaps even peace in the future? I know also it's a big question, but you touched upon it, but how do you see renewables as kind of a bridge now into the future for this not green growth economy, but a more sustainable economy?
Well, I think in contrast to the circular economy, which doesn't contribute anything to sustainability because no one puts any limits on resource extraction, I think renewables is combined with politics for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that actually works. Even though we're using, and we're not sustainable, of course not, but we have politics to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in many countries, greenhouse gas emissions are in fact decreasing. And that is not because of the renewables, I think. I think it's not because we put in more renewables that the greenhouse gas emissions are decreasing, but it's because we're trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. We have politics for reducing it. We have taxes on greenhouse gas emissions and so on. We have economic instruments to do it, and using them makes it more interesting to replace the fossil fuels with renewables. So the renewables are not only added up on top of the fossil fuels, it's actually replacing them. At least in Europe, at least in those parts of the world where we have efficient climate policies. I think, for example, in China, they use both. I mean, they're growing their fossil economy and the sustainable or renewable energy systems. So there is just still the fossil fuels and the renewables are just adding to the energy system. But in some parts of the world, we have politics to reduce, and that is what is needed, I think. And it's also needed in terms of material consumption.
A very important point, I think, and also that perhaps to be clear here that we're talking about, and if I understand you correctly in your report, you're promoting that some areas, of course, can grow. I mean, renewables as an area, as an industry, if you will, can grow, and other parts of the industry, oil industry, and so on, and material use in general has to decrease from today's levels. And the overall economy cannot grow, but certain sectors can continue to grow immensely from where they are today, as long as other sectors are decreasing the same way or even more. Is that a correct interpretation of what you want to say in the report?
Yeah, I would say that. So I mean, economic growth usually means that the whole economy is growing. The GDP, which is the sum, is growing. So we only have economic growth when the GDP is growing. But that doesn't mean, of course, that different sectors cannot grow within a stable economy. So even if we have a steady state economy where the GDP stays exactly the same or even decreases, things can happen within the economy. So you can have a redistribution between sectors, just like you say.
Well, yeah, we covered, I think, most of the key points. Material use was, I think, very important in the report, and people have to realize this, that it's all about, exporting and importing products unnecessarily. We have to avoid all this kind of waste of energy and waste of resources. Just by doing this, we can come a long way in a short time, I think. And that's perhaps also important to remember. We don't have so much time. We really have to do this transition fast. Is it anything you want to add? I think we covered a lot of things in your report. Something you think you can mention?
No, I think I just wanted to add to your last point that, of course, there are very many things we can do, but don't waste those things in a growth economy. Don't use, I mean, if we just do all these things and keep growing the economy, then we can't use those things anymore. I mean, if we cut all the wastes, for example, we can lower our resource use a lot. But if we do that at the same time as we're growing economy, then that measures are useless.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I just repeating myself, but I think it's such an important point. So
yeah, definitely. I totally agree. Thank you, Mikael. This was really interesting, and I really encourage my Swedish audience to read the report, and for others to check out my previous episode with you. I'll provide a link where we talked in depth about 4 different scenarios for the future, which is relating to the Swedish economy, but is applicable, I think, to many other regions and countries in the world. And so I really encourage people to check that out, and I'll provide the links, as I said, in the description section. Thank you so much, Mikael.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Can we transition to a fossil-free economy and move away from economic growth to something sustainable and still live healthy and happy lives? What do you think? And if you want to support the show, hit the thumbs up and consider subscribing. In the next episode, I will share some amazing new milestones for Einride that I think will be of particular interest to my American viewers. Einride is a world leader in developing electric trucks that doesn't even have a cabin. And I was among the very first investors in the company back in 2018. So stay tuned for that. As always, stay ahead of the curve and stay electric.